I'd like to welcome you to this Ofsted webinar. My name's Mark Enser, Ofsted Subject Lead for Geography. In 2019, when we launched the Education Inspection Framework, we ran roadshows across the country to share our curriculum thinking. We recently revisited those principles and shared an abridged version of those 2019 roadshows to help make our message as sticky as possible. You might also know that we've recently released research reviews for many areas of the curriculum, and our subject leads have shared short videos that consider how pupils make progress and the implications for curriculum thinking. Our reviews and videos have been received with enthusiasm and have been followed by a series of requests for us to speak at further national, regional and local events. To make our subject insights as accessible as possible and to provide even more detail, we've compiled a new suite of webinars to support the sector based on the subject reviews. In today's webinar, we turn our attention to geography, so please look out for further videos where our curriculum unit cover other subject areas. And just before we get going, I want to emphasise what I hope will be a few reassuring points. Firstly, we've structured this video in such a way that I hope means it will be useful and accessible for teachers working in all phases of education. Secondly, Ofsted doesn't expect the language or specific examples shared today to be replicated in schools. Instead, we hope that subject-specific examples shared will illustrate general principles about high-quality geography education that you will find useful as you develop and refine the curriculum in your school, particularly given the challenges of the last 2 years. As our inspection handbook makes clear, schools have the flexibility to choose their own curriculum approaches, as long as there has been sufficient thought to its content, structure, sequencing, and implementation. This video is divided into 3 sessions. In the first session, we will explore some of the subject-specific principles relating to curriculum and progression in geography. In the second session, we will consider some of the implications of these principles for practice in schools, focusing on 3 areas: pedagogy, assessment, and approaches to catch up following disruption to education. In the final session, we will briefly look at an example of how these principles might be implemented in a primary and a secondary setting. So let's start with session 1, curriculum and progression in geography. It is really useful to draw a distinction between the curriculum and pedagogy or assessment. The curriculum is what is taught. We are now clear that no activity, however enticing, can be a substitute for the intended curriculum. That's not to say that learning can't be engaging, of course. It is just simply that what must come first. Only then can we consider the activities and pedagogy that might best lend themselves to teaching the content and ensuring it is remembered in the long term. And that brings us on to what knowledge pupils should learn, a fascinating area of debate in our profession. In geography, the national curriculum gives us a way in which geographical knowledge can be organised. Much of the literature follows a similar pattern. What the national curriculum or other documents don't go on to do is detail the content in any great extent. We do have broad areas outlined for each key stage, but the depth of coverage is not given. When constructing or revising the curriculum, identifying the content to be taught is one of the first challenges. The second is the need to build up pupils' knowledge over time by returning to previously learned content and developing it further. We will start by looking at these 4 pillars of progression in geography. They are a helpful starting point to ensure that the curriculum builds up the knowledge that pupils need to develop in geography. We will also consider sequencing within these 4 pillars, how this knowledge is built up in a way that supports pupils to progress. Fundamentally, location is one of the cornerstones of geography education. We want pupils to know where's where because it provides explanation as to why things are as they are. Let's take a really simple example. Appreciating latitude underpins global atmospheric circulation. By appreciating that air moves in our atmosphere and knowing where that air is moving from, it will indicate whether the temperature is likely to be warm or cold. So thinking about location knowledge is also part of our thinking about sequencing. We might need to identify locational knowledge which pupils need in order to learn about a particular phenomenon or process in geography. It's also through the location that children and adults understand relationships and gain a sense of place and connectedness, which is one of the features of our discipline. So by knowing where locations are, pupils can understand more clearly why certain processes or phenomena happen. We could use the distribution of volcanoes around the North Pacific Ocean to explain tectonic plates, or look at the world distribution of lithium to understand how countries like Chile and Australia are central to the recent and very rapid growth in demand for batteries which use lithium. It also helps pupils to gain some understanding into global trade and interdependence. And the journey of gaining locational knowledge starts in the early years. Here, children learn positional language and gain an understanding of the concepts that go with it, such as near and far. The curriculum should build from this basic understanding through Key Stage 1, with the 4 points of the compass and a growing knowledge of the geography of the United Kingdom, to 8 points of the compass and a knowledge of Europe in Key Stage 2, to a global view in Key Stage 3, which pupils will draw on in Key Stage 4 and the sixth form. For scale, we might start from a smaller scale with the youngest children, a plan of the classroom or a local street, to a national level, and onto a continental view before gaining a good understanding of the global. Even with these examples specified in the curriculum, these are still fairly broad goals, and schools need to make decisions within them. For example, the choice of locations to be learned is broadly set out in the national curriculum, but specifics will be down to the schools and individual teachers to choose. For example, in Key Stage 2, pupils could name and locate counties and cities of the United Kingdom. It does not say which counties or which cities, and to cover them all would certainly be ambitious, so choices have to be made. Decisions about content and sequencing are intertwined. We might have some idea about what content we want pupils to learn in terms of locational knowledge, for example, the names and locations of a number of counties. We will need to sequence this knowledge. So do pupils know what a county is, or understand the concept of a border, for example? This might be a useful building block towards knowing about counties. But other sequencing considerations might also lead us to adapt our content. For example, if we're going to look at proposed economic development, such as free ports, or look at differences in health outcomes in 2 counties in Year 9, we might want to make sure that pupils know a bit about these particular counties earlier in the curriculum. A second pillar of progression in geography is knowledge of human and physical processes. Again, the national curriculum gives us broad headings for the human and physical processes that pupils should study. That need not limit the curriculum, and indeed many schools explore other aspects of geography beyond the national curriculum. Equally, as with locational knowledge, the national curriculum does not specify exactly what should be studied or in what depth. Again, schools are free to make decisions about the specific content and how this is sequenced. Volcanic eruptions, global trade, coastal morphology or settlement development, all of these are geographical processes most teachers are familiar with. Here, it is really important that we think about how children build up their knowledge over time. That translates into identifying the building blocks of each process and making sure pupils have securely grasped each element or component before moving on. And also remembering that we will have to go back over the previously taught material as we build up our knowledge, giving pupils opportunities to revisit and practice to secure their knowledge. Rivers is a good example here. In Key Stage 1, we might introduce the concept of a river. We might be building from the learning in the early years, following a visit to a local stream, but the depth of knowledge here will be fairly limited. Perhaps pupils will know that rivers usually start in higher ground and flow downhill, or get wider until they meet the sea or a lake. At this point, it is important to not only think about the knowledge we want pupils to learn, but the misconceptions that we need them to unlearn. Perhaps some pupils believe that rivers start at the sea, or that they run from one sea to another. If this isn't addressed now, new information will be added to weak foundations, and the misconceptions will just increase. In Key Stage 2, we may be looking in more detail about how water gets to the river, linking to the study of the water cycle in science, how rivers change as they mature through their course, and also introduce some knowledge in human geography about how people use the river and threats that the river may pose. We may compare 2 different rivers, perhaps one local to the school that pupils are likely to be more familiar with, and one in continental Europe or North or South America. We would be doing this not just to produce a fact file of information about two rivers, but to help people see what rivers have in common, the processes that shape all rivers, and the things that vary, and the processes that cause them to vary. Perhaps human intervention or the geology. We can see again here the importance of sequencing. Will the pupils have learned something about geology before needing to apply it to those rivers? And by key stage 3, we'll be recapping the stages of river development, but also looking more closely at the hydrological processes that shape the surrounding land, the distribution of the world's rivers, appreciating them as systems within river basins separated by watersheds, and management of water on Earth, including the water cycle, water resources, and environmental sustainability. We are probably looking at the influences of other processes, such as glacial melting and deforestation, on the dynamics of the river system. All of this is building on foundations laid down in previous key stages and then built on throughout key stage 3. So you can see here how the complexity builds from those basic components to a complex, systematic understanding as pupils progress. A third pillar of progression in geography is place knowledge. The literature broadly defines this as the knowledge through which pupils locate or orientate themselves with respect to the larger global space and to other places. As a dynamic subject, place knowledge is really helpful to us as it brings together specific locations at particular times and considers the interplay between them and the human, physical, and environmental processes that are happening. A focus on this connectedness is one of the key features of geography as a subject. This is often done through case studies, where a particular event, location, or group of people are studied to appreciate what happened or is happening, and just as importantly, why. For example, pupils may study Nigeria, first considering its location and hypothesizing how this location might shape the place, perhaps noting its location close to the equator or on the coast. They then might hear about Nigeria's history and how it's been shaped by other places over time and how its location helps to explain these relationships. This would go on to inform their understanding of the human and physical processes that have affected the place, the flows of people at different points in time, or the threats posed by rising sea levels. When studying the place, they are in fact studying the interplay between location, time, and processes. The final pillar of progression in geography is the development of geographical skills and fieldwork. This includes the development of observational skills, using and understanding globes, atlases and maps, undertaking fieldwork using geographical resources like aerial and satellite imagery, and teaching pupils how to present data appropriately. It also takes the other pillars of progression to give pupils the knowledge to be able to analyse their findings. Particularly in geography, pupils are interested in spatial distribution patterns and trends over time. These geographical skills give pupils the knowledge they need to be able to describe their findings. They will need to draw on their human and physical process knowledge to be able to explain change. As elsewhere, the curriculum needs to be designed so that pupils build up their knowledge and skills over time. Pupils' locational knowledge will support the development of map skills, for example, but there are also specific building blocks of map skills that pupils need to be taught sequentially and developed. And again, they will need opportunities to practice and revisit these. It is this revisiting and practicing which turns the procedural knowledge of how to do something into a skill of being able to do it, is the capacity to perform. Fieldwork is an integral part of geography. Pupils need to be taught the skills and processes that are used to collect, analyse and present data. But they also need knowledge about geographical processes in order to be able to draw conclusions, and indeed for older pupils to be able to construct their own fieldwork tasks. They will also need to be taught how to evaluate the strengths of the conclusions they reach based on the data they have, how to discuss issues of reliability and validity. This will be important in developing disciplinary knowledge, as we'll discuss later. To really embed this teaching, pupils should practice these skills regularly, and research shows us this is the most powerful when integrated into pupil studies. Fieldwork does not equal field trips. It is possible to learn many of the analysis and presentation skills in the classroom using others' data sets. When collecting first-hand data, this can be on the school site. For example, microclimate surveys or surveys of the effects of weathering. Of course, for some phenomena that teachers want pupils to see in action, a visit might be necessary. In this case, it is important that pupils have the procedural knowledge they need before they go off site and that they are suitably proficient. This means time spent at the data collection site can be used effectively and not spent demonstrating equipment for much of the time. As well as being really effective in supporting pupils' memory, it also introduces pupils to the more personal and social aspects, such as evaluating risks and working safely, essential teaching for a healthy life. Building the opportunities to teach geographical skills and fieldwork skills into the curriculum, opportunities to practice within schemes of work, and the regular opportunities to apply their skills on the school site or in different locations should be a clear feature of the geography curriculum. So let's look at one example of the interconnectedness of these pillars and how pupils can build up their knowledge in all of these pillars to enable them to learn greater complexity. Consider this aerial photograph of Mar de Plastico on the Almeria coast in Spain. Pupils might have been taught geographical skills of interpreting aerial photographs, for example, understanding scale, but they will also be drawing on lots of other knowledge. So let's zoom out and build up our understanding. So location first, well, Almeria is in Spain, Europe, and Spain is located southwest of France. What a pupil will identify and make sense of from this photograph will depend on their prior knowledge. These are plastic greenhouses. Pupils might know enough to identify agricultural processes at work here. They may also identify other physical and human processes. We can see a peculiar shape where land meets sea. These are groins, and they are trapping sand that's being moved eastwards by the sea, a process called longshore drift, a process that pupils will pick up again in Key Stage 3. We can see some settlement on the coast. We can also see some roads. So let's zoom out a little. If we zoom out, we can see a port and a number of boats. Pupils should have some knowledge about ports building up from Key Stage 1. We can also see a large airport. Pupils' prior knowledge, locational knowledge about Spain, knowledge about agriculture, port, trade, climate, all give them a foundation to learn about this place with greater complexity. And tracking back to early years, we can see the knowledge that pupils need to know to understand the human geographical processes of economic activity, including trade links, by the end of year 6. We have the underlying knowledge about the conditions for plant growth, soils, nutrients, water, sunlight, the processes of agriculture, transportation, drawing on understanding about the topography of the coast, the physical geography. We also have harbours and ports. This is on the Key Stage 1 content list for human geography. There's the appreciation of what trade is, and of course relationships, such as the EEC, as well as perhaps historic relationships. We could draw in the controversial aspects, such as migrant labour from North Africa, soil and water pollution, visual pollution, and the matter of discarded plastic sheeting as more negative impacts. A huge body of knowledge which we could track back to looking at where our food comes from in the early years. They might learn that this area of Spain has been an area of intensive crop production since the 1960s. Exports of fruits and vegetables in 2012 amounted to 1.9 billion euros, with 359 companies exporting from the complex. Almost 30% of Mar de Plastico's production is exported to Germany, followed by France. The rest is sold in Spain itself. And because produce such as bell peppers that are grown here are highly perishable, they will be exported by air, hence the airport. The shorter the transport time between picking and landing on the supermarket shelf, the fresher the product. In this case, it could be less than 24 hours from greenhouse to your fridge. Pupils are developing more knowledge, richer mental models of concepts like trade, but also richer place knowledge about this area of Spain. If we aren't careful, we can end up seeing geography as a series of distinct units, ones that focus on either location or place or processes or skills. However, what the example of Almira should show us is that pupils should always be building on their prior knowledge by combining it and using it in new ways. The different threads should go together. It is really important that they remember certain pieces of fundamental knowledge, such as the countries of Europe and their climates, so that they can use this locational and place knowledge when considering processes such as trade. They need to remember the fundamental knowledge about trade, such as the terms import, export, and comparative advantage, so that they can take it and use it to help them understand barriers to development. One of the key curriculum decisions that schools need to make is what should pupils remember and when will they use it again? This photograph shows a Yanomami village in the Amazon rainforest. We might talk to pupils about the housing design, with houses often built on raised platforms due to frequent floods and with minimal walls to allow cooling air to flow through the buildings. We might talk about the way people fish, using natural toxins from certain roots that paralyze the gills of the fish in the river, allowing them to be scooped out using baskets made from the reeds. But how this is endangered by pollution from often illegal mining operations, which washes into the river and builds up in the fish before being passed on to those eating them. We could talk about the way they farm and how they work as a community and minimize disruption to the nutrient cycle, or how their traditional ways of hunting with a blowgun is being supplanted by less appropriate technology like the shotgun, and the wider impacts this has on their way of life. In short, there's a huge amount of knowledge we might really want to use to help our pupils understand how people live in this region and the world and the pressures they face. However, much of this knowledge is what we call hinterland knowledge. It is knowledge that supports them learning the core knowledge, but we don't necessarily expect them to remember all of this for years to come. It helps them in the moment to grasp the salient points. The core knowledge, on the other hand, is the knowledge we expect them to be able to recall in the future. It is the geographical knowledge that future knowledge will be built on. It is useful to identify what knowledge is core and what is hinterland, so that we know which knowledge to base their work on and which knowledge we want to test for. Pupils should learn disciplinary knowledge to take a holistic view of the content studied, so that they can establish whether the geographical questions posed, the methods used, and the answers found are valid. They should learn it to recognise the interconnectedness of different geographical content, to appreciate what it means to be a geographer by asking geographical questions such as, why is this place like this? Or how is this place changing? And how are other places affected? Teachers must be aware of disciplinary knowledge to ensure that pupils appreciate the context in which substantive knowledge was generated. This helps pupils to appreciate both context and the perspective from which knowledge was created, different standpoints, and how views have changed as time has moved on. Geography is a dynamic subject where thinking and viewpoints change. Ultimately, we want our pupils to develop disciplinary knowledge, to be able to think about geographical questions in geographical ways. However, this disciplinary knowledge, the ability to think geographically, is based on a foundation of substantive knowledge. For example, we might want pupils to have a geographical understanding of an issue, such as whether to place wind farms in the Lake District National Park. For them to be able to think about this issue in a geographical way, they will need locational, place, process, and skill knowledge. They will need to know the location of the national park and how this location affects things like wind speed and existing land use. They will need to know about the Lake District as a place. What is it like? How is it used? The issues about building a wind farm here will be different to those affecting a different place. Then they will need a broad knowledge of a range of human and physical processes. They will need to know about the threats posed by climate change, to weigh up the potential global benefits of the wind farm against the potential local costs. They will need to know something of resource management and the changing demand for energy in the UK, and know what the alternative to wind energy are. There will be a wide range of skills that pupils will need to have in order to make sense of the information around the issue. They may need to interpret graphs, comparing the costs of different energy sources, use maps at different scales to identify the features of proposed sites, and perhaps maps showing wind direction and strength. They will also need to know how to evaluate whether they have reached a valid conclusion. Can they explain how other people may have reached different conclusions, or why a different conclusion might have been reached in the past? We can see here that our ability to think geographically is based on the knowledge we have to think about. If pupils have not grasped this substantive knowledge, they cannot do geography. One tool to help us think of what geography we want to teach pupils is to consider what David Lambert refers to as the grammar of the subject. The substantive knowledge we teach is the vocabulary, but the concepts that sit behind them and organise them are the grammar. Johnson proposes that the big concepts in geography are space and place, scale and connection, proximity and distance, and relational thinking. We can see how we might use these to plan a curriculum if we take a topic like settlement. How do we ensure that we teach pupils something geographical about settlement? Or we consider it through those concepts. We might teach pupils about settlement through the lens of space and place and ask the question, how do settlements vary according to the environment in which they're found? Or we might consider the impact of proximity and distance on settlements and consider settlement hierarchy. How many cities, towns and villages do you find in one region? How does this compare to a different region and why? These concepts give us another way to ensure that the substantive knowledge we are choosing to teach is respecting the discipline of geography. So some key takeaways from this first session. There are 4 forms of geographical knowledge. The curriculum should build pupils' knowledge over time. Each component, part of the knowledge, needs to be identified and learned before moving on. And the curriculum should respect the discipline of geography. So if we move on to session 2, in this session, we'll consider how our principles of curriculum in geography might affect our choices relating to pedagogy and assessment, and we'll also briefly consider the role of catching up after the recent disruption to education. In thinking about the activities that teachers choose, the aim is to ensure pupils learn and remember the knowledge that teachers have identified and emphasised. In geography, the choice of activities is vast, and there are many resources that teachers can draw on. In selecting the activities or approaches, teachers should consider how this is helping pupils to learn and remember the content. Some activities are more helpful than others. Consider the way in which a puzzle map of Asia could be used to help pupils build their schema of countries and cities of the continent. This allows pupils to see the connections between the countries and to familiarise themselves with each country's position and with the major cities. This is an effective pedagogical choice because it helps pupils learn the content which has been identified. But now let's think about the activities relating to making volcanoes. If the content we want pupils to learn is limited to what a volcano looks like, then these might be effective activities, although this is often limited to one simplified form of composite volcanoes. However, if we want pupils to learn how volcanoes form, the processes involved, or the like, then these pedagogical choices would be less effective as they don't clearly help pupils to learn this content. In some cases, they may even develop misconceptions. Pupils may build up episodic memories of the time they made a volcano. These are memories linked to a particular event. They won't necessarily develop the semantic memories of how volcanoes behave. Semantic memories are not tied to the point in which they are learned, which means they can be applied to new situations. So we teach so that pupils will remember the key content. Through a well-constructed, organised and sequenced curriculum, allied with careful lesson planning, there should be a greater retention of content in memory. The practice of revisiting and extending, building from familiar and remembered features and places to different contexts, comparing familiar places to unfamiliar ones, and giving opportunities to apply what has been learned has been proved to be particularly effective. We have also discussed the need to practice regularly the geographical skills that are central to the subject. We mentioned fieldwork earlier, but also maps, globes and atlases, especially for secondary school age pupils, the use of geographical information systems. And then the low stake testing or quizzing that brings forward knowledge that is sitting deeper in the memory into the working memory. This strengthens the ability to recall it in the future, interrupting the forgetting curve, as well as allowing pupils the chance to reconsider prior learning in light of what has been learnt since. When we talk about interrupting the forgetting curve, We're referring to the way that we quite rapidly forget new information we have been given. However, every time we are reminded of it and are prompted to recall it, we slow this forgetting and can recall it more easily in the future. Therefore, we want to give pupils frequent opportunities to recall what was taught in previous lessons and occasional opportunities to recall what was taught longer ago so that their learning is secure. They can then use this prior learning to support them remembering what they are now being taught. And this leads nicely into assessment. How do we know what pupils have remembered during the lesson, at the end, next week, next month, or even at the end of the key stage? Assessment can serve different purposes. We have summative purposes, an exam, assessment of learning. We have formative purposes, an end of topic test to identify gaps, the missing components in learning. That's assessment for learning. But we also have memory building, repeated short, low stakes factual tests of geomorphological processes, which should be assessment as learning. To support progress, we want assessment for learning to identify any aspects of knowledge that pupils are not secure in. Therefore, when assessing, whether that's through questioning in class, in a quick quiz, or in an end of unit test, we should be thinking back to those components of knowledge, the building blocks identified in our curriculum. Any gaps in these crucial building blocks will have a significant impact on the pupil's progress, so they need identifying and remedying quickly. There can be pitfalls that schools fall into. Most prevalent is the use of GCSE grades in Key Stage 3. This can be problematic. In fact, even early in the GCSE course, it is not helpful as the grade criteria have been written to assess the whole body of knowledge which pupils have not yet developed. These kinds of assessments are much less useful for identifying specific gaps in knowledge than assessment which is designed expressly for that purpose. In terms of catch up or recovery, there are 4 ways schools could consider catching up, closing some of the gaps that have opened up as a result of the disruption over the last few years. Firstly, we need to assess what's been taught. You know what you taught during the national restrictions, whether online or face to face, so it will be important to assess how well pupils have remembered that knowledge. But you will also know what has not been taught, and so there's little point assessing that. Knowing what pupils have remembered will give you a secure base to plan or adapt your plan from. Secondly, we need to make choices. There will be content you revisit through the key stage. Weigh up the significance of teaching it repeatedly in different topics. For example, in Key Stage 3, in climate change, it's a feature we often look at through different lenses, such as biomes, glaciation, natural resources, and flooding on coasts and rivers. So we have the opportunity to teach missed content on climate change through a study of those different topics. Picking out what is essential is critical. The questions to ask are manifold. Firstly, do we teach this elsewhere? If yes, is it fundamental to the work we're about to undertake? An example here would be weather. If pupils are not secure in the elements of the weather in Key Stage 1 or early in Key Stage 2, they will struggle to properly understand most of the environmental and physical processes that we teach. However, there may be other components which are not crucial at this stage and could be learned elsewhere without impacting pupils' progress through the curriculum. Thirdly, we want to integrate. Although there's often a need to discreetly teach a particular skill or piece of knowledge, think carefully about integrating wherever possible. For example, can you use maps to explore different land uses? And can you look at water management when studying hot deserts? Fourthly, focus on memory. In a constrained amount of time, it's critical that the knowledge you want pupils to learn has been remembered. There's no point in covering the curriculum if nothing is learned. One repeated positive that we hear from teachers arising from remote learning is the laser focus remote teaching gave to teaching activity choices. In remote teaching, there is so much to distract pupils, and activities need to be very sharply focused on ensuring pupils pay attention to the most crucial details they need to learn. It is worth considering how much more children can learn when activities are time efficient and really effectively ensure pupils focus their minds on the most crucial content to be learned. We know from research that discovery learning approaches are not efficient when you are first learning new content. We also know that it's easy for children to latch into the wrong details. How often do the pupils who spend a lesson on matching fruits to a country of origin remember where these countries are or why these conditions are so good for such plants? Curriculum content can be innately fascinating. We want pupils to enjoy lessons and remember the content we have chosen as important for their education. Choosing time, efficient activities, using effective strategies will allow pupils to progress more rapidly through the curriculum. In being efficient, it may be that several topics are integrated. This can be a strong approach, but the content to be learned must be clear. It is easy to deviate from the intended focus when integrating, whether that is within geography or across subjects. This is another reason it helps to identify the component knowledge in advance so you can ensure you still include it when integrating different topics. Otherwise, it can be too easy to overlook something critical that doesn't seem to fit. For example, if integrating water management into a unit on hot deserts, you may find that you do not cover cross-border water transfer schemes and their associated issues. By identifying the component knowledge in this part of the topic, you can check that it still occurs and is still learned. So our key takeaways from this second session: make the actions appropriate for the subject and phase, the activities that you're choosing. Use assessment wisely. Identify which knowledge is most significant when choosing what to insert into an adjusted curriculum. Ensure pupils still have the time they need to repeat or practice crucial content so that it is remembered long term. And choose teaching activities which are time efficient and most effective to ensure the planned content is learned. So on to our final session. Over the next 20 minutes or so, we'll consider how the insights I've shared might look in action in our schools. It's important to think about pupils' geographical education as a journey, and that journey starts in the early years. The new early years foundation stage sets out more clearly some of the knowledge we can identify as geography. This knowledge should be identified and its acquisition not left to chance. Such knowledge includes knowledge necessary to describe the immediate environment. This knowledge may be gained via observation, discussion, stories, non-fiction texts and maps. Knowledge necessary to explain some similarities and differences between life in this country and life in other countries. And again, this knowledge may be gained from stories, non-fiction texts, and where appropriate, it could be from maps. Knowing some similarities and differences between the natural world around them and contrasting environments. This knowledge may come from experiences and what's been read in class. Know about some important processes and changes in the natural world around them, including the seasons. The curriculum should identify these foundational aspects as well as other areas covered in different areas of learning. Most significantly, positional language, for example, near and far. We can then build on these. So we introduce some of the vocabulary that is used to codify the concepts in Key Stage 1, such as north, south, east, and west. We build up pupils' fine motor skills and their precision through drawing plans and maps. We may start with a simple outline of the classroom with some shapes for desks and cupboards with a clear knowledge of these objectives in mind. As I mentioned before, the depth of coverage is not specified, and the breadth might not include all you think is essential. It's important, therefore, that subject coordinators have the knowledge they need to make or help colleagues to make the choices. Very few geography coordinators are geographers by training, and we know that typically there's not a lot of geography training on teacher development courses. So it might be that this is something that has to be sought either from organisations who provide that support or from texts or other resources. Content choices can be guided by the national curriculum, but they also need to consider the building blocks of knowledge, the components which need to be learned about each topic. What do pupils need to know to prepare them for what they will go on to learn? We must consider this depth in which we study any particular area of geography. The national curriculum gives the broad descriptors of what pupils should learn, but it's up to individual schools to decide exactly what and in what depth pupils will learn about them. For example, the national curriculum that states that pupils will learn about settlements, but it will be up to each school to determine what they should learn about settlements. Well-selected case studies can be used at any age to allow pupils to learn about ideas, concepts and processes in geography in depth. A school might focus on settlements in South America and consider why settlements of the indigenous people in the rainforest are different from those people of European descent along the coast. Geographical skills include the ability to read and produce maps, including those displaying different types of geographic data, such as choropleth maps, and to read and produce other forms of data displays. It also includes the ability to collect geographical data and to analyse the findings looking for statistical significance. They are skills which are distinctly geographical in nature, in as that they allow someone to do geography. As we mentioned before, we will need to teach geographical skills explicitly when we first introduce a skill, but once pupils have got the hang of it, research shows that it is through application that pupils will gain fluency and automaticity. So we can practice when we are learning other aspects of geography. If we are thinking about recovery priorities, it may be that you can combine across subjects. For example, using a tally chart for a traffic count is a useful data collection method. This may well link with Year 2, who cover tally charts in mathematics as well. Finally, consider the resources available. There are a few questions we can ask about resources used in geography. 1, are they accurate? For example, do atlases and globes show current boundaries, country names, and even the up-to-date countries for that matter? Are other resources true to the source? Are outdated images being used to perpetuate outdated thinking? This can be a particular issue when teaching about other, especially less economically developed areas of the world in which stereotypical and harmful images may be used. Pupils end up learning a single story about such places and do not come to know about the variety of experiences in that place. Schools may wish to use a resource like Dollar Street, which shows recent photographs taken from across a country and help to reveal the differences that exist within a place. Thirdly, do pupils have the foundational knowledge to make sense of the resource? There is little point in pupils being presented with a resource discussing the impacts of a tropical climate on a settlement if they do not remember what a tropical climate is. And then finally, are they authentic? If pupils are learning about the landforms on a river, is a real river being used or one that's been created? It's a big wide world out there that pupils should be learning about. We don't need to make up places in geography. Careful choices of end of the day books can really build that sense of place. Books like Anne Lawrence's Travels of Oggy is a great book at introducing place and journeys. The language is rich, it builds in locational knowledge too. But a health warning: if the book is to be one that children are to read themselves, then their reading ability, their ability to decode the language, must come first. And a helpful link to the next section is that with their knowledge of locations, place, and geographical processes, the richness of text can really come through and help build vocabulary and strong comprehension. This example of map skills shows a simple sense of progression, from a simple outline to using grids and color coding and an early key, to directional, compass, row, scale and key. This increasing complexity, as well as lots of opportunities to practice what they have already learned, helps pupils develop increasingly secure and complex schemas for these skills. This helps to show what we mean by making progress in geography. However, progression is not always so obvious or visible. In the map skills example, we can see the progression very clearly. We need to think carefully about sequencing to help pupils progress in their knowledge of, for example, human and physical processes. The journey, particularly from year 1, starts as associating phenomena with vocabulary and builds over time, deepening our knowledge of processes. For example, year 1, we can start with the coast, beaches and cliffs, appreciating different coastlines. We can then bring in settlement and consider harbours and ports as parts of towns and cities. As we enter Key Stage 2, we start to think about Earth shaping. So start perhaps with rocks and soils linking to Year 3 science, and then on to mountains, followed by the water cycle, drawing on Year 4 science, to rivers and on to compare different rivers, perhaps the Thames, the Rhine, the Amazon or Colorado, ones from the UK, Europe, North and South America that are in the Key Stage 2 curriculum. Knowledge of physical and human processes allows pupils to describe and explain different environments. Through this study, pupils can develop an appreciation of interconnectedness. In the example given above, how rivers affect settlements, how the water cycle affects rivers, and then putting it all together to consider why three rivers behave both similarly and differently. By layering up this knowledge, pupils make progress. They can do more geography because of what they know. So what about pupils' progression in a concept like trade? Pupils' knowledge builds in the same way. They'll develop a schema for trade over time through encounters with this concept and rich examples. Pupils might learn this word early in their education in a very everyday sense, e.g. swapping items. Having at least some idea of trade means that pupils have an idea to hang new information on when they learn more complex examples of trade. Here, though, there are many other bits of underlying knowledge, the foundational knowledge pupils need to develop a complex knowledge of trade. For example, knowledge of nations or states, of transport, of economics, of the idea of comparative advantage in growing foods for export, which match your climate, and importing those that don't. All of which will allow them to learn more complex ideas. Sequencing all of these different components can be very challenging. But we know that it is important to help pupils build schema for some of the most important concepts early on in their education. Then, just like map skills, they need lots of opportunities to practice by encountering these concepts again and again and in different contexts, using them in their own writing, in their own speech, and to develop the complexity by learning about new and more complex examples of trade. Eventually, a secure and sophisticated mental model of trade will be one of the components which allows pupils to understand complex case studies, like the Almira one we shared earlier. Here we can see what we mean when we talk about the curriculum being the progression model. They are making progress in the topic on trade because they know more and have remembered more about the foundational knowledge for this topic. People get better at geography by building on their prior knowledge and applying it in new, more complex ways. This means that thoughtful sequencing of lessons and of different topics is vital when considering the geography curriculum. We should always ask not just why are we teaching this, but also why are we teaching this now? Let's imagine that you want your pupils to know about the factors that influence the location of settlements. What does it mean for pupils to do this well? To make progress on what they knew and could do before? It would mean that they used their prior knowledge to make sense of what they were now studying. They would need to know about the different types of settlements and the services found there. They would need to know about the different resources needed for human development, food, water, energy, and where they can be found. They might need to draw on their knowledge of landforms and processes associated with rivers, a common location for settlements. They'll probably need to draw on their ability to use OS maps to help them identify the features surrounding settlements. So here we can see progression. They can now do this work on the location of settlements because of what they know about other topics. This also helps to give sequence to the curriculum. We are learning about settlement location now because we have studied these other topics. It also allows us to think about what comes after. When will pupils use this knowledge of settlement location knowledge again? When can they revisit it and build on it? It could be they will do this when studying South America and look at the settlements found there and how they are shaped by the physical geography of that location. The thread gets thicker and stronger as more is added. We need to think carefully about the implications of this sequencing, because if something disrupts it, such as lockdown or a pupil joining the school partway through the key stage, it has implications on how well they'll learn. Hopefully, remote learning during lockdown allowed the curriculum to still be taught and learnt, but it's possible that the disruption meant that less was covered or it was learnt less securely. Let's imagine that a topic on resource management was taught during lockdown and that less was learnt. Or if a pupil joins the school late and misses this topic, without this knowledge on resource management, they may struggle to understand why settlements locate in one place and not another. They may have missed work on where they evaluate the relative importance of different resources and thinking about the idea of applying a criteria. This means that they learn the knowledge associated with settlement location less well. Without this knowledge on settlement location, they are also lost when it comes to studying elements of the topic on South America, perhaps struggling to understand why Manaus exists in the centre of the Amazon, or why cities prioritise access to drinking water over access to farmland. Luckily, a well-planned and well-understood curriculum also helps to provide the answer to this problem. Because teachers will know that their pupils will be drawing on their knowledge of resources in the topic on settlement location, they can use formative assessment methods to check who has this prior knowledge to use and make plans to fill gaps for those pupils who do not. For the curriculum to be the progression model, it's not enough that the curriculum is taught, it must also be learnt. There must be that change in long-term memory. Take our previous example of learning about trade. We might want to draw on prior learning from a unit of work looking at Spain as an example of a European country and have pupils explain why the UK imports tomatoes from Spain. They would need to remember the location of both Spain and the UK and the comparative climates of the two countries. This is core knowledge that we would hope our pupils would remember so they could use it again in the future. We might therefore want to make sure we assess whether pupils have retained that knowledge, not only while studying Spain, but again before we start teaching about trade. This will both help them to retrieve the knowledge that they'll need and also help you to identify any gaps that need addressing before moving on to this new topic. We can see here an example of an assessment often used in geography. Pupils have been learning about rivers and in particular about river floods, and they're going to use what they have learned to produce a newspaper front page. However, we need to think very carefully about such assessments to ensure that the geography we intended to assess is genuinely the focus on the work. Are pupils going to be thinking about the Boscastle floods and the complexity of identifying causes, or are they going to be thinking about the layout of the newspaper front page? What particular knowledge about the floods are we expecting pupils to demonstrate in their work? And if it's missing, we will be able to identify whether this is because they don't know it or just that they decided to omit it. It's likely that we will really just be assessing a piece of descriptive writing and not their geographical knowledge. We see the same issue with assessments that attempt to assess whether pupils can evaluate or create rather than what they can evaluate or create. Instead, we may wish to use a more granular approach, which assess the component knowledge that allows someone to write an account of the Boscastle floods. This would tell us what they had remembered and what they hadn't. We could then follow this granular assessment or series of granular assessments with an assessment of their ability to apply what they have learned to a genuine geographical question. The big question looks at the composite of all those components and asks that they use them to do something geographical. We can then give a criteria for what a good geographical answer would include to act as scaffolding, with the amount of detail in the criteria fading away over the year or key stage. So our key takeaways for the primary curriculum: we want to think about progression from the early years to year 6 and consider where they go from there. We want to balance breadth and depth. We need to sequence carefully with increasing complexity. We need to integrate geographical skills throughout these different topics and ensure that case studies and resources are appropriate. We want to use assessment widely, including granular and big picture assessments, but throughout we want to keep the focus on geography. Pupils will arrive from many primary schools with very different experiences of geography education. So it will be important to establish what they have learned and remembered that's relevant to accessing each new secondary topic. The information this provides will give insight into the coverage, but also the depth of knowledge that pupils have gained and consequently what needs to be taught and to what level. We'll look at an example in a minute, but often inspectors see pupils repeating and not progressing in their geographical knowledge of some topics, volcanoes and earthquakes being a good example. The added complexity or challenge in terms of the curricular goal is not there. Equally, we see neglected areas of the primary curriculum that are not picked up in Key Stage 3. Pupils should be developing increasingly complex knowledge. As in our example of Almira, the choice of location for a case study is important. It should allow pupils to see the connections and understand how processes and people are interacting. In the next couple of slides, we'll work through an example of this, looking at level of complexity we might introduce older pupils to if they have secure knowledge built up through the earlier curriculum. And finally, once pupils get to Key Stage 4 or Key Stage 5, the curriculum is more than the GCSE or A-level specification. Like the national curriculum, they give a skeleton of content, but there will be more that is usually covered, and the choice of examples and case studies is left to schools to select. You'll also choose to emphasise different aspects. What might the level of demand look like in a Year 7 case study? Well, we may look at a local planning issue, such as the building of a new industrial park. This requires locational knowledge, the where, and consideration of human processes such as urbanisation and transport. We may think about landforms that make it easy or more challenging to build on the site. Place knowledge would come through by thinking about the positive and negative effects on local people and wildlife. What pupils have learned in Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2 will hopefully have given them a strong foundation to access this greater complexity. By Year 9, we may scale it up to look at a multinational development, such as the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which is currently being constructed. Pupils would typically consider the implications not only for local people in the area of the new reservoir in Ethiopia, but also the implications on water security for people in Sudan and Egypt. They're able to access this extra complexity because of the secure knowledge they've built previously, the richer and more complex locational knowledge, place knowledge and knowledge of human and physical processes. The quality of their evaluation is also likely to be more advanced. Hopefully by now, they can consider the sustainability of a project through a lens of the economic, social and environmental implications. They will also be using more complex data to reach conclusions about the project. We can also see the potential for progression in procedural knowledge, the knowledge of how to perform different geographical skills, and in building disciplinary knowledge. If we look forward towards the non-examined assessment in the A-level course, it becomes particularly clear. As part of this assessment, pupils are expected to propose their own geographical inquiry and root it in geographical theory. They need to develop their own methodology, including a justification of the sampling used, and then present this gathered data in a range of suitable forms. This data needs to be analysed, including statistical tests of significance, where appropriate, and this is used to make conclusions and then evaluate their strengths. All of this with almost no input from their teacher. This is the point we need to get pupils to by the time they're in Year 13. But progress towards this point starts in primary school and should certainly be well reflected in the secondary curriculum. When you look at your own curriculum, ask yourself, where are we teaching pupils to form geographical questions or make judgments about the most suitable ways to display data? Have that endpoint in mind. Because the geography curriculum can be thought of as cumulative, made up of lots of disparate topics that pupils are expected to learn, there's a danger that each of these topics becomes its own silo. Pupils learn about a topic like tectonics. They fill up what they know about it and then put it to one side, never to be touched again. As they then move on to study something else like resource management. Each topic or unit of work stands alone, often crammed into a half-term block of time to make its separation from what comes next even more stark. The problem with this approach is twofold. Firstly, it weakens their ability to use what they have learned in previous topics because they don't have the opportunity to retrieve it again in different ways. This makes the learning less sticky. A second problem is that it weakens their understanding of geography as a subject. How will they understand the underlying grammar of the subject, as we discussed earlier, if all they see are these separated units of work? What unites tectonics and resource management under the discipline of geography? As subject experts, we may see the links between them, but they are not obvious to a novice. These issues become particularly clear, particularly stark at Key Stage 4, where the specification can become a de facto curriculum, with schools simply working through the specification in order into very clearly separated key ideas. A better model than that of the silo may be that of sourdough bread. One way to make sourdough bread is to take a piece of unbaked dough from your first loaf and to save it ready to incorporate into your next loaf. Before that second loaf is baked, you remove a piece of dough containing some of those first two loaves and put it into the third loaf. You repeat this again, so that every loaf that comes after incorporates some of the dough from the previous loaves. What this means for our curriculum is that we want to take something from each topic and think about how it can be used in subsequent topics. Perhaps some of the tectonics unit on managing tectonic hazards could be used when looking at atmospheric hazards. They could compare and contrast the ability to predict, prepare and plan between these two units. When studying resource management, they might consider how hazards, both tectonic and atmospheric, make the ability to access resources more challenging. And when looking at barriers to development, they might study and apply this very problem to a case study. By doing this, our pupils do not only get the chance to revisit and retrieve, but can see how their prior learning can be applied in different ways and why it's so powerful to have. Building on prior knowledge as a way of adding complexity and depth is a way of seeing progress. It means that the curriculum becomes the progression model. However, for this to work, it is not enough for the curriculum to be covered. It has to be remembered by the pupils. We need that change in long-term memory. Just covering tectonic hazards won't allow pupils to use it when studying atmospheric hazards. They'll need to remember it. They'll need to remember what they heard about appropriate technology in water management to apply it to their work on hot deserts. Coverage is not enough. Places are, of course, important to geographers. If we're not careful, pupils can walk away knowing very simple stories about places, as they only encounter them in one way. Bangladesh is only encountered when learning about floods, and Brazil when learning about deforestation. We need to give careful thought to the role these places play in our curriculum. The Key Stage 3 curriculum gives an indication of locations to be studied: Africa, Russia, Asia, including China and India, and the Middle East, focusing on their environmental regions, including polar and hot deserts, key physical and human characteristics, countries, and major cities. Locations in the Americas and Europe, as well as the UK, are covered in the primary curriculum. The Key Stage 3 curriculum also states that a region in Africa and in Asia should be studied to allow pupils to learn about the geographical similarities and differences and links between those places. These kinds of regional approaches should allow pupils to see how different geographical themes operate within a region. It is here that they may see the interaction between the climate, settlement, migration and tectonics, and use the knowledge that they have gained to answer geographical questions about those places. At Key Stage 4, things are often different. Exam specifications tend to call for a case study or example to be used to typify something being studied, but little if any guidance is given on what those case studies and examples should be. These decisions call for some deep curriculum thinking from those writing and enacting the curriculum. What we want to avoid is using places that pupils will only encounter that one time and only in that one context. This would lead to pupils learning a single story about that place. As we say, Bangladesh is reduced to nothing more than a country at risk of flooding, and Brazil becomes rainforests and favelas. This is where curriculum thinking across Key Stage 3 and 4 can be useful. If you know that pupils are going to study Nepal as an example of a case study of an LIC or NEE that has had an earthquake, but want to ensure this isn't all they know about Nepal, then you could ensure that Nepal in a different context is studied in Key Stage 3, perhaps looking at the impact of tourism on emerging economies. That way, when they come to study the place in Key Stage 4, they have some deeper understanding of the place. It is also possible to do this within Key Stage 4. Nepal could be used as a case study of an emerging economy and or used as an example of a small-scale water management scheme. Whether done within a key stage or across them, it's critical that place knowledge is built upon just as any other form of substantive knowledge would be. Issues around assessment and progress often become conflated with summative assessment grades. However, most of the time when we think about progress in geography, we mean how well has the curriculum been learnt? What do they know and what can they do that they didn't know and couldn't do before? Deciding that a pupil is a grade 6 on a past exam paper doesn't tell you whether they've learnt that volcanic eruptions can be predicted, but earthquakes can't, and the implications of this, whether they can now draw an interpreted climate graph. For this, we need assessments to be more granular. In order to assess the progress pupils are making through our curriculum, we need to know what it is we expect them to know and be able to do. The core knowledge, both substantive and procedural, needs to be explicit, and then assessments need to be created to test whether pupils have this. We need to be able to sift out the core knowledge in our curriculum from that which is hinterland. If we don't, we may find ourselves assessing whether the hinterland knowledge has been retained rather than the core knowledge it was meant to support. These assessments might not be in the form of exams. Teachers assess constantly in their lessons by looking at pupil work or asking them questions and evaluating their answers. A question all teachers should be asking themselves is what happens next? If they identify that a pupil doesn't have the knowledge they had thought they'd learnt, what measures are put in place? If these gaps are not filled, then the foundation of their prior knowledge will be weak and later learning, which builds on it, will not be secure. This is why in a subject like geography, high quality formative assessment of the curriculum is important and why responsive teaching is even more important. To finish, let's briefly look at how knowledge pupils have built across their whole course of study prepares them for a challenging task like this. It draws on the full breadth of learning covered not just at GCSE, but through a child's whole schooling. It's also fairly likely that pupils will not have studied the so-called favelas of Rio, so remember that pupils will need to draw on the knowledge they have previously built about areas such as informal settlements and coastline management and apply it in this situation. For example, coastlines are first stated in the national curriculum in year 1 and 2. Pupils will have come back to them in Key Stage 2 and will have explored coastal processes like longshore drift in Key Stage 3. To answer the question will require detailed understanding of many components, including sustainability, squatter informal settlements, coastal erosion processes, coastal management, economy, tourism, climate change, sea level rises, quality of life indices, permanence, improvement schemes, to name but a few. This knowledge can only be developed over time through a curriculum which carefully identifies the key component knowledge which pupils need, sequences this intelligently, and ensures that people learn and remember this content in the long term. So our key takeaways from this final session. We want to consider progression from early years to sixth form and beyond. Where is this knowledge going to take them? We need to identify content at a component level and identify the emphasis that we need. We need to balance breadth and depth. We need to consider the sequence carefully and with increasing complexity. We want to consider the integration of geographical skills. Pupils must have the opportunity to practice what they have learnt. We need to ensure that examples, case studies and resources are appropriate, and we need to use assessment wisely. Many thanks for taking the time to watch this video today. If you haven't already read them, you might also find our subject research reviews helpful. Simply search by subject in your browser. Our YouTube channel also has a playlist of other subject webinars and many more videos about our work here at Ofsted. Finally, I'd like to say thank you for all that you do in your school to support pupils. We wish you all the very best.